Welcome to the Women in Robotics Project Advance speaker series, where we interview women and non-binary people about their journey in the field of robotics. Feel free to type your questions in Zoom, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook chat anytime during the event. We'll circle back in the last 20-25 minutes of the session. My name is Cynthia Young, Head of Product at +ONE Robotics and a founding board member for Women in Robotics. I'd also like to take this opportunity today to thank my fellow Women Robotics Mentorship Committee members, Laura Snelzner, Carrie Fetzer-Borelli, Hallie Siegel, and Andra Kay. Today, we are very excited to welcome roboticist Maria Telleria as the third interviewee in our series. Dr. Maria Telleria is the co-founder and CTO of Canvas, a construction robotics startup. Driven by a desire to create tools and machines that work for the user, she is extremely passionate about creating machines that make construction safer and open up more opportunities for skilled workers. She received both her undergraduate degree and PhD from MIT, where she focused on centimeter scale robotics and no barcode machines, which are cheap, low energy robotics for one-time use. In addition to being featured on RoboHub's 2019 list of 31 women in robotics you need to know about, her company Canvas was also recently featured on Forbes's AI 50 list. In this Women in Robotics interview series, we'll be exploring the inflection points of women's career journeys and try to identify patterns that may help others in the field. So without further ado, welcome Maria.
Thank you. Excited to join everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. So in previous interviews, you've talked about the influencing of your grandfather and how you came from a family of engineers. So how did your interest in engineering hone in on robotics specifically?
Yeah, like I've mentioned before, but I grew up in Mexico and my family, a lot of engineers, a lot of working with tooling, specifically both my dad and then my grandpa's company who sells tools to the automotive company. So the cool part there was I got to go to these factories when I was young and see automation kind of really helping, right? If people have had the chance to go to an automotive assembly line and you just see robotics everywhere, right? The speed that these things are being built at was just incredible. But I also got to see the other side, the other big industry where I grew up was jeans. They sewed a lot of jeans. And so you got to see the completely opposite manufacturing, really driven by people and, not great working conditions, right? A lot of hunched over. And you kind of had this little bit of like, why does one look so much better than the other? And that's kind of how like my introduction to engineering really started to hone into like, what's the difference between them? And a lot of times that was automation, right? Whether it was robotics per se or just some other tools that were specifically designed to the manufacturing. So that's kind of how I started kind of honing in on, I want to bring robots to the other side. I want to work with them. I want to see this and see how they can be better conditions for people if you give them better tools.
That's really interesting. So, when you were brought to these types of environments as a child, was that intentional on the part of, your father or grandfather? Was it something that like, you were like, as a little girl, like, hey, I want to see where you guys work? Like, who instigated that actually?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I think early on, my dad instigated with like, help me fix things around the house. He is a manager through and through, so he loves kind of giving directions. So it was great for him to be like, you help me with this. And small hands can be really useful in tasks around the house. It's like they could just kind of naturally was a little bit of exposure. But then, I have an older sister and very quickly became clear that I was like particularly interested in it, right? And so like once he saw that, it kind of fed itself, right? And then I wanted to push a little bit more. Why don't we fix it, right? Like, why buy a new one? We can take it apart and do something like that. And so with that, I think it just really kind of got my dad like excited about taking me to these places, to see what they got to do. And in particular, my grandpa's factory was, a little bit like you could come and see and ask all the questions that you want. So it was just always like whenever we got to travel to where they lived, I was like, we have to go see it. I want to see the latest machine. So it became a little bit of this self-reinforcing where they were excited to show me something, but I also really showed that interest and asked a lot of questions. So it kind of helped them really see why that I wanted to get into it and understand more.
Got it. And would you say that like, at least like, when you were younger, so, before you went to college, was that interest also sort of encouraged by your teachers as well, or was this primarily family driven then?
Early on when I was growing up in Mexico, it was primarily family driven. There just wasn't as many opportunities in the school, but right before high school, my dad's job transferred him to the US and when I joined my high school, I learned they had a robotics team, and that was kind of like the super spark, right? I had thought about robotics, they were kind of cool, but they were still a little separated, right? I had dealt much more with machinery and hand tools. And so that first robotics scene was just kind of like that, oh, that gateway into it, and really got into it. And at that point, yeah, teachers and older classmates became kind of really those people that pulled me in further, and really kind of showed me this how to create something to solve a specific problem, right? I think that's one of the cool things about First Robotics. The game changes every year, so you get more into the design, versus my earlier interests have been more like, how do things work? How do I fix them? But I hadn't had that exposure to like, this is a problem. How will you design something to fix it, right? There's nothing there. You have to start from ground zero. And that was just kind of that super spark to just really solidify that I wanted to get into that.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like, in some ways, coming to the US and going to this kind of, new school, exposed you to first robotics. Was there something similar in Mexico at all? Maybe like, in the larger community, or how would you say that, immigrating really from Mexico to the US kind of impacted your career there?
I think it was a huge impact. Nowadays, I think there is more opportunities, but when I was in Mexico, there was nothing that I at least had seen or had kind of that opportunity. I'll say, as a 14-year-old, I was not very happy to move and kind of like leave all my friends behind. But like, as hindsight, being able to see just like that acceleration, right? I don't think I would have had any chance to go to MIT had I not had that introduction to it. And then I even got to go, MIT has the MITES program, which is the Minority Introduction to Technology and Entrepreneurship, over the summer. So I got to do that in my junior year, between
Oh,
junior and
wow.
senior year in high school. And that was just, again, just the stepping stone to getting into, the career path, right? I was very lucky that that move kind of led to all of this other opportunities opening up. So if I could go back, tell my 14-year-old self, don't be so hard on your parents. It'll work out really well.
So this MICE program, that sounds really interesting. How did you hear about that? How did you decide to apply? Like, because it really seems like that was actually, one of the reasons why you ended up, choosing to go there for your undergraduate degree.
Yeah, it was a huge reason. I just heard about it through like counselors in high school. But it is a program that you run every year. And the idea is to really like, give that extra opportunity for people that may not have a chance to be exposed to MIT or to more science and technology. So in particular, going with, minorities who doesn't have that. So even though my high school was great, it had the robotics program, like nobody had gone to MIT before. So it was just kind of this great, like, I'd heard of it. It was kind of this exciting. I remember my grandpa actually always talked about it, just as something he admired, but, had never even had a chance to see it. And so that program was the chance to go there and refine it and really get into it. But it was also really good on that side, because one of the things, as I was applying to colleges, I had seen how hands-on MIT was, which really spoke to me back to the background that I had on like fixing things. So some of the other schools that I went to visit were maybe a little bit more theoretical. And when I knew like MIT had that really hands-on experience, it was just like a good fit for me, because I wanted to kind of get in there and touch the things, right? More in I knew that I was a mechanical engineer early on.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, on this kind of like, hands-on component? Like, what was like the moment or interaction or thing that you saw that like, made you kind of realize that like, hey, this is the place I want to be at?
Yeah, they actually, there is this famous class at MIT that you do sophomore year where you're building a robot. It's kind of like a little bit of similar to first, right? In that you're giving a new problem and you build a robot, but it's just yourself, which was a very different experience for me. I'd always worked in a team, but for MITES, they recreated a similar thing. So I got to be like in a class where, we were building a robot, but at the same time, there was a class around it. So that was kind of that step above, like with first robotics had given me, there was even more interaction of like, okay, let's learn more about gearing. And then you'd go and build it into your robot. So that was like, the fact that even in that 6-week program, we got to spend like 4 of those weeks building a robot was like very hands-on. And then all the classes in general had a component that was like, even, the entrepreneurship classes, which I also really enjoyed, had like you work with the team to make a little product plan and then like a business plan and everything like that. So it was like very applied, right? Even if it's not necessarily tinkering on something, every class had that very applied component to it, which really spoke to me.
Interesting. So, you talk about like, really enjoying this hands-on, like, aspect of it. How did you go from that then to being like, okay, you know what, I want to spend the next, 5-6 years of my life, doing a PhD now instead of going to industry? Like, how did that thought process kind of work?
Yeah, that one was one of the cool parts back to the hands-on is that they had their undergraduate research program. So I got to start doing research. And a lot of times graduate students got undergraduates because, I guess you could give them a lot of those tasks that you just needed built. So I remember I
Not
was
so small hands anymore.
exactly not so small hands, but a lot of time at a low cost. So I was assembling this like 10,000 needle array for,
Oh,
but
wow.
although it was kind of like this way to just introduce you to it, it got me to see really like what research was like. I think I had some idea, but again, I hadn't been exposed that much to people with advanced degrees in my career other than teachers, right? So it was really cool to see kind of the students getting to test something. And I'm like, why are you doing this? And they're like, well, I just have this theory that'll work. I'm like, oh, wait, that's enough? Do you just think that something is interesting and that we can explore? And then my senior year, my advisor was, kind of was encouraging me to stay for grad school. But I was like, oh, I don't know. I always thought about going to industry. I want to start working on something. But he just kind of challenged me to go to the career fair. And he's like, talk to people there and ask them what, like, once you find somebody who's doing what you want to do, ask them their background. And I did find that a lot of people had advanced degrees who were working more on the R&D side of their company. So if they were more on the production side or something like that, there was all backgrounds, but specifically when it was like, oh, what you do is really cool, I found a lot of advanced degrees there. So it was kind of like this really good way of like me seeing for myself like what an advanced degree would allow me to do.
That's so interesting because I think very oftentimes the decision to kind of do a PhD is sort of framed as this choice between industry and academia. So it sounds like if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like actually you went into the PhD program with the full intent of still going into industry even afterwards. Is that true?
Yeah, I was academia had some interesting things, but for me it was a little too not enough of a team part of it. So I enjoyed more. And I think for people who are in that boat, I think finding research opportunities like in academia that are funded by an industry can be really good, right? Because then to me, that was a lot of our programs had very specific applied results that we were doing. So we worked a lot with industry. So I had that nice way of staying connected to what industry was needing as I was developing my skills further. But yeah, I will say it's a little bit different, although I do find that most people end up doing a PhD, end up in industry anyways. So it's kind of,
I mean,
even
there are
though they
very
think they're
limited
going to do
roles and
academia.
I mean, there's just aren't that many slots at the end of the day, I think, in
Exactly.
academia, which is hard. So I guess like, with this idea that, you pursued graduate school with the intent of still going into industry, how do you think about, the choices that, some people have to make between doing a master's and a PhD? What's the sort of relative value from your perspective as someone who both, did a PhD, but also as, a hiring manager, as a founder of a company now? How do you evaluate and think about that?
Yeah, I'll often tell people like, for me, a master's felt really valuable, right? I think it just gave me that opportunity to hone in on a little bit more specificity, right? Undergrad, often you just have so many requirements that you're still pretty broad. And so the master was a refinement. So I have encouraged a lot of people to go after that if they just feel like there's an area I just want to get more into, right? Or like within robotics, I learned that I really like, controls and dynamics. The master's gives you that background to really kind of put you a little bit beyond, right, the rest of the candidates. The PhD is one that I'm a little bit more hesitant to whether to recommend
Mm.
because I do think it's a bigger commitment and it should really be driven by not by saying like, oh, if I get a PhD, I can get these jobs, because I do find that as a hiring manager, industry experience is so powerful, right?
Mhm.
It's sometimes hard to get somebody straight out of academia. They just haven't had the same challenges, right? Often like cost or that just have the different. So for PhD, for me, I always kind of say like, look, that one should just really completely be driven by there is such a topic that you're so excited about that you want to dedicate, time of your life to advance that project, but don't do it as like a stepping stone to another career path. I think you'll be better served by taking that knowledge from the masters and going into industry, or even undergrad and going to industry, challenging yourself there. And the PhD to me feels like it's just be something so like personally driven. I just think this problem is so interesting and I want to flex that or want to explore the path of academia a little bit further. But it really has to have that component. We're just so excited because it is tough and it's not necessarily the fastest path to maybe a higher career. Is really much more of a driven to move the field in a way or another.
So maybe touching a little bit more on that note, like, in your, personal experience, then, like, if you were to go back to, like 20 something, like Maria, would you have encouraged her to, pursue her PhD, like even knowing that you're going to kind of start your own company, like later on, that like may have some relevance to like, what you ended up doing, but, maybe not directly so much, or would you have been like, hey, get the master's and, spend that extra like 3-4 years on building your company? Like what would you tell, that 20 something Maria?
Yeah, I think for me, um, starting a company was much more like once I found the problem, I wanted to start a company. I know there's people who are much more driven, like, I want to start a company. You're like, oh, what company's like, oh, I don't know, but I want to start a company. And that was not my drive. Was much more like once I found the problem, I was like, okay, it makes sense to build a company around it. So for that, going back to kind of that decision point as I was finishing my master's, I didn't have anything that I had identified that was kind of like, this is what I want to spend like or build a company off of. And so but I was just so excited by the research I was doing at that point. So it was kind of that like, I like it, I'm really excited. But what I did do during the PhD was like, also, okay, then use those years to strengthen yourself in other things. So I took much more entrepreneurship classes and business management classes that kind of, even though they weren't required for the degree, said, look, you're at this institution, might as well. And I joined like, the different, like the global startup program at MIT and stuff like that. So learning a lot about pushing myself to strengthening that side. And I think that was really helpful. Once I did find what I wanted to do, I was like, okay, I have much more of that background. So I think that that's what I would probably say to people. It just depends, right? If your drive is to start a company, then probably jump in it as quickly as you can because it's a long path and you'll probably have some failures and come back. But if you're a little bit more driven by like a specific solution, it's finding the right time, right? Because it's going to be a hard road and, doing it just because, if you don't have that motivation. For me, I don't think I could have done it without that. Like, I really believe in this. And yes, I'm going to go through those late nights and like all those tough times because I believe in what's on the other side of it.
Got it. It sounds like you really took like great advantage of all the resources that were available on campus. Wasn't just the engineering department, but these sort of entrepreneurship classes and other things like that. So that's really great to hear. When you're starting Canvas, obviously, I think you've landed on something like really amazing. But what else did you consider before deciding that like this was what you wanted to start your company? Like, were there any other ideas, or were you like always like, hey, like no, I found it, this is it, or were there like, 20 other things that you had, considered before going down this path?
Yeah, I took a little bit of like a, I guess, tiptoe step into founding a company because as I was leaving, I joined Other Lab, which is basically an academia research, but outside of academia. So it's really cool in that sense. So it was a little bit more of a lateral step. And I was so excited because I was still very driven by the academic pursuit of like new things, but Other Lab had that spin of like, but in the end of the day, we don't want a paper, we want a company out of it, right? So that was like this really nice switch for me, but I'll say it wasn't like a deep dive right away. Like we were founding a company, we were still, I joined Other Lab in 2014 and we didn't spin off till 2017. So for 3 years, we were still government research, to your point, exploring all these different paths, right? We work with NASA, but we also work with the Office of Naval Research and DARPA, and we work with Airbus and other companies who were kind of looking at this. The general idea was robots we thought had to be designed differently to go into other places that are not as controlled as like manufacturing, right? The moment that you have either a changing environment like you do in construction, or for example, space where you don't even know the environment, there was a lot of, our hypothesis is a lot that even from the hardware, build a robot in a way that it is much more able to interact with the environment rather than this like super controlled things that you see in manufacturing. Everything's, calibrated perfectly. So then the robot doesn't have to do much adjustment to it, right? The environment is almost adjusted to it. And so, but as we kind of pulled on that thread, we really got into understanding, okay, what were our strengths, right, of the solution that we had come up with. And like this, for example, sanding soft surfaces had just become something we had gotten really good at by exploring all these different applications. But then came the path of like, okay, but where are we going to start the company, right? Space is limited customers. Even aerospace was limited customers. So it was a little bit of that, we call it like the 1,000 conversations type of canvas, where it was like a little bit exploring all of the industry. So yeah, we definitely looked at a lot of places, and then also looked at a lot of like what in the technology is the key enabling, right? And we left some of our research behind at other lab because we were like, that's not enabling drywall finishing. We'll leave that behind. Let's also focus on like taking that big step away from research and really doing just what is needed to solve the problem.
So it sounds like you were exploring like a lot of different things through other lab before starting Canvas. Was there like a particular kind of like aha moment where you decided like was it a conversation with a customer, or was it after having talked to like 100 customers, or what was that like inflection point where you're like, okay, this isn't just an idea now. This isn't just one of the other 10 ideas. This is what we're actually going to spin off into, because that can actually be a pretty scary moment sometimes. Like, so what was that decision point like?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. I would say it's like combination of moments, but it kind of started with one of my co-founders. Henrik was talking. He's more from the business side. He was talking to a bunch of people, and we were looking at like painting and different things. But as he was touring a hotel that was being actually built, the owner told him drywall is my pain point, and we had looked at that. We had thought about putting the sheets up and everything. We're just like, oh, that's really hard with the robots. But he's like, oh no, that's easy. People are good at that. It's the finishing, right? Applying this material so it looks like a single coat. So it did take somebody to kind of like point us a little bit to this very, you look at construction and you say like, oh, we want to do construction robotics, but it's like so broad, right? So slowly we had kind of honed in, and then this person pointed that out. And so then, he came back excited, told us about it. And then it was like the process of, okay, well, let's do the back of the envelope, right? How long will it take us to do it with a robot? What is the cost? What is this? And kind of when we were working through that, and then at the same time, what's the market size for it? And we're like, oh, people use a lot of drywall in the US even. And so we kind of had those things. So once that like math was working out, and we knew from, then we continued to ask other people, is this as big a pain point for you? Those two kind of like, I was more on the analysis side. We were doing all the analysis. Henrik kept asking questions, and we were just like, he's like, I still think it's a good idea. And I was like, yep, the math works out. It's still a good idea. We kind of just looked at each other and said like, all right, well, then this is it. And then the next question is like, how do you get a system, whatever it is, right? Even if it's duct tape together, but how do you get a system out on site as quickly as possible so that we can confirm that, right? So that we can really double down and say like, this is it, we're spinning off, we're doing our thing. And that was kind of like, at that point, I was like, all right, team, and let's get this robot out there as quickly as possible. And it was rough, but we got it out there, and we kind of saw it, and we were like, yes, it can be done. And customers were receptive to it. So we just kind of had all the boxes checked at that point.
That's great. So it sounds like it was a combination of like both like actively listening to prospective customers, as well as doing some of the market research. So it's not just purely anecdotal. That's kind of helped drive this decision making. A lot of our members often ask about what it takes to start your own company. What other advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I definitely would say like especially in robotics, I think the anecdote and knowing that the pain is there is real, but there's also being like very realistic about what robots can do, right? And I think when your market analysis requires that a robot is working 24/7 and there's nobody interfering or like helping it succeed, and that's the only way you make your economics work, I would put like a little bit of this, like, people often say that, but the reality of it is it's so hard to get there, right? So looking for places where you can make your economics work, even in a conservative scenario, rather than a blue sky, everything works out, look how well this can go. The other one is like, I would say talking to other people who have gone through it, right? Because there's just so much knowledge, even from like, how do you reach out to investors, to how do you, de-risk a little bit faster, right? So that was talking to people we knew who were like, get the system out there quickly, right? No matter what, because you guys just have to be in the field to really make this real. So I think it was talking to a lot of people. And then getting people who are industry experts on your team, right? Especially if you're not an expert. So for us, we were like, great, we're great roboticists. We know nothing about construction, right? Or we know very limited about construction. So then very quickly we brought on two people on our team, Anna and Teresa. Anna had like more the business strategy side, where she had worked at like prefab homes and everything. So she kind of understood the economics really well. So we were like, okay, help us refine this, back of the envelope. And then Teresa had been a taper, so a drywall finisher for 30 years. And so we were just like, okay, you need to come in and actually tell us what are the people looking for and all of these things. So I think that'd be another really part I would say, is quickly be humble enough to know, like, look, you can't know anything, so everything. So bring in the people, especially in the industry that you're trying to get into, because some of the biggest challenges we found had nothing to do with robotics, right? And it was much more about getting into the industry.
What would you say would be an example of that?
Yeah, I think there's just like, for example, construction is, you have the general contractor, which we all sometimes call it almost the wedding planner, right? Because they're just coordinating all these people that are coming in and doing the work. And then you have the subcontractor, which drywall finishing is a part of that. So just even understanding the structure of, like, in some ways you have three customers, because you have the subcontractor who does the work, but they're hired by the general contractor, but they're hired by the owner. So us understanding that and the politics within it. So, sometimes we made a misstep. We're like, oh, we went and talked to the owner, and they're like, whoa, you don't do that, right? You follow a little bit of the chain of command. So having people who understood that there is some challenges, who controls the money in that relationship, right? Who has an innovation budget versus who doesn't, and can kind of help you understand that, and especially at the starting point, step into it. And even from the worker side, right? Having Teresa, somebody who actually did this for us, we just knew right away that was going to be a tool, right? Like, construction is just way too dynamic, and people are just way too amazing at like adaptability to really, and for us, envisioning an completely autonomous system. We just said, let's make a better tool, make that one person more productive. That's the way to win. And so having her be on to help us understand, like, what drives them, what motivates them, how do we approach, right? How do we get them to give us the honest feedback as opposed to what they think we want to hear? And honestly, just having her tell them, like, hey, I've seen this machine, it works, is so much more powerful, no matter what I could say, right? Like, it's like, but you don't do drywall, you haven't been out there. And so having her be our spokesperson to the craft workers was huge.
That's interesting. What skills, whether they're hard skills or soft skills, like I think you were talking about, like, kind of this understanding of social dynamics, what types of skills do you think prepared you well for your role, and which ones do you wish you had invested in earlier in your career?
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah, I think from soft skills, especially when you're starting a company, at the end of the year, you're going to be a manager, right? You're going to build a team underneath you. So I think a lot of soft skills about thinking about how to align people, motivate people. Startup is a lot about aligning people behind a mission and a vision that you have. You're not going to have it all worked out, right? There's not going to be this beautiful project plan with three people. It's going to have to be much more driven by, we all know the vision, then we can work on it and explore things, but we always keep our North Star. So I think that soft skill of, like, how to motivate people, how to manage them, how to help encourage them grow has been really helpful. And I think part of that, I had just developed it from working on a lot of team projects, even in school, and pushing myself to do more, presentations and stuff like that. I remember, like, team projects, oh, who's going to present? Everybody's like, eh. And I just kind of knew that at the end of the day, you're going to have to be that voice. So kind of pushing yourself to every opportunity that there was, like, will you talk about this? I was like, yep, I'll do it, because it is just a good way to practice. And then on the hard skills, particularly in my role as CTO, right, there is kind of this understanding of all the components, and robotics is particularly difficult because you have from mechanical all the way to software, right? And it's a broad range. Like, you probably need 2 or 3 PhDs to really actually do a robot all by itself. So some of the soft skills was knowing the parts that I needed help with. I wasn't as strong in software, so I brought in people from the software side really early so that we could work together and build it. I do wish I'd gone a little bit more into the software component, and even in my mechanical. I've actually seen the degrees change even in the time since I left, where you're starting to see more software classes, which I think is great because software is just kind of blending in a lot more. But I wish I jumped into that a little bit. I just like the building too much.
Well, so I guess maybe on that note, then, what skills would you say, like, you spend the most time working on these days?
Mostly, I would say like soft skills, right, in management, but also I think from the hard skill side, a lot of what my role is now is that vision, right? Like really be thinking 12 months ahead. How are we going to get through that hurdle? Staying up to date on the latest technology. Not that doesn't mean I need to understand it all, right? But like, how do you encourage your team to stay up to date? Who do you talk to learn the latest? So talking to a lot of other entrepreneurs, right? And being like, oh, have you guys implemented this new edge computing? Okay, what are you learning from it? So I think a lot of on the hard skills is much more what are going to be the risks? What do you anticipate? How do you put mitigation things in place? I ask the team a lot to run little feasibility studies. So I pull off a little bit of the team and I say, okay, for 6 weeks, I just need to investigate this. Not that we're going to implement it anytime soon, but I need to know if it's feasible because I'm making my long-term planning, right? And I'm counting on us being able to switch to this when the time is, but let's run this feasibility study. So that's a lot on the hard skills, what I'm doing. And then of course, it's a lot of talking to people, thinking about how to build a company as a co-founder. That's my biggest role. Like what do we want our values to be? Are we living up the values? As you grow in size, you also have new challenges, and mid-level managers, can you develop them? Can you help them grow? How do sales and all these things that you slowly are peeking into it, but as you're starting to grow and scale, become bigger. So it's a lot more about coordinating, building the right teams, and then talking to a lot of people, whether it's investors or candidates, and getting them excited.
These new skills that you're developing, would you say like, you're primarily learning from, other mentors, people who've been sort of, doing this and, or have been in the field for longer? Would you say it's primarily through, your peers, people who are kind of also kind of, started a company and are kind of at the same stage that you guys are? Is it through books? Is it through other resources? Like how are you kind of, going through this process of, constant growth and learning?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of everything, but I would also add coaching in there. We
Mm.
kind of brought on leadership coaching for ourselves, and I think that's been really helpful. People who think about this and challenge you on like, okay, how could you have to handle that situation better? And yeah, I think mentors can do some of that coaching, but it's also nice to have like a coach that's their job, right, to kind of help you improve. So we've implemented that now for a couple of years, and it's just been a huge help to have somebody you can kind of go to and like lay out a problem and talk through about how to improve it, and then give you some skills. But sometimes it's just talking through that specific problem, right? Because I think books are great, you get kind of the general idea of it, but like the implementation, like what
Mm.
if this was slightly different? And I think a coach and a mentor are able to kind of help you. Okay, that's a good principle. This is how you apply it to this very specific instance that you have.
Bridging that gap between theory and implementation, sounds like.
Exactly.
Great. Again, a quick reminder to everyone who's listening, feel free to, type in questions to the chat. I still obviously have many questions that I'd love to ask, but, it's always good to hear from other people too. I think we have, one question around, I guess there's a question basically around kind of, automation and the impact on labor. How do you think about that? Because I know you've definitely said some interesting things about how you think it actually opens up opportunities. So can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely one of those challenges. And I think one of those things you really got to think about in robotics and be very conscious, step into it rather than like try to ignore it. For us, one of the things that we learned as we got more into construction is that there is a labor shortage when it comes to skilled workers, especially we work specifically in commercial construction rather than residential, just because the volume is bigger, it just makes sense, right? And so as we kind of dug into it, we're like, wait, what do you mean there's a skill, right? You always kind of hear this. They're like, well, it's hard, right? Like there is a lot of training that goes into becoming this crafts worker. And this is where we partnered with the union early on. We said like, okay, the union's training people to make them better, but they were struggling to get people to join the union. And once you look at drywall finishing, you understand why, right? There's a lot of repetitive motion. Like a lot of our workers have had shoulder surgeries, right? Because you have to do this over and over again until your shoulder kind of wears out. There's a lot of dust, which is really hard. So you start seeing a little bit, or a lot really, why the unions are kind of even pushing for this, because they're just having trouble bringing in the new next generation into it. And you get it right. It's like, hey, join. It is a very good paying job, but you might have to retire at 50 because your body will just give up on you, right? And so the union's struggling with this. They need the members to support, right? It's there's a pension with the union. And so talking to them, it made us realize, okay, let's really focus on that augmentation. What if that person could work to actual retirement age?
Hmm. Oh, wait, I think the internet may have.
Now you're robotic, but you take that brunt of the work and put it into the robot.
Sorry, you might need to repeat a little bit of the last, maybe like 10 seconds or so, because the internet seemed to have briefly frozen on my end, at least. It looked like you were frozen.
Yeah, sorry about that. I got the internet unstable part of it, but can you hear me okay now?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, I think.
So I heard the part about the unions and the pension, and then I think that was roughly where the internet briefly cut out.
Oh, great. So yeah, I think for us, as we work with the union, we understood that if we focus on creating a tool that augments their workers, we solve that problem, right? One, you make the workers that are available more productive. You extend their careers by taking that brunt of the work, but you also encourage new people to join the construction workers because you're giving them better tools, right? You're saying like, hey, now there's a career where you're having a robot do the brunt of the work, but you're still using all that expertise and all that skill to make sure that it happens. So it was just kind of this really encouraging thing. We just jumped in and we said, let's talk to the union, right? They're the ones who know this, they live it every day. And we saw them really talk about like how they saw technology as this enabling piece for them to have a stronger workforce. There's still a lot of challenges and you got to look at it, but the biggest thing we saw is the shortage of skilled workers because the career is so tough. So it's like, how do you make those jobs be better for the people who are doing them and then encourage other people to join by bringing in new technology?
Got it. As a quick follow-up to that, how has the last 2 years of COVID, sort of, impacted what you've seen in the market then?
Yeah, definitely has been challenging for the workers because there's more restrictions, but yet the expectations that they produce the same amount of work. And I think that's been one of the hardest things with construction is we've put in, even in COVID, more safety measures, which are great. But even before that, right, we're putting in more safety measures, protecting them more, but the expectation of productivity is the same. And so it creates these really tough working conditions where people are held to like things like, they used to be able to use stilts, for example, to finish ceilings. We said that's really dangerous. But now you're going up and down, but they're like, why aren't you finishing like you were 5 years ago? And they're like, wait, there's a big gap here. And COVID had a similar thing where it was like, take more breaks, wash the tools, work more separately from each other.
Wash the tools.
They implemented washing the tools. This especially early on, right, when I think we weren't quite sure the transmission. There was a lot of these things, and yet the expectations were the same. And so it put people into this really hard part. So for our workers, having the robot allowed them to work in spaces like more on their own, right? Not as crowded because the robot could be that addition to it. It works at heights, so they don't have to be going up and down, and tools, like the lifts and the ladders are things that you share. So there was this ability to have this extra protection with the robot and the drive. I think the biggest thing is just supporting an industry with new tools. As you ask them to produce more, you got to give them tools to do that.
Got it. Another question from the audience. So, there's a lot of different pieces, to building a robot. There's software and hardware. For Canvas, what was the more challenging aspect of it?
Oh, that's a great question. I think early at the start of it was hardware, right? We had to get hardware that was reliable enough and that could deal with this. We don't map the space perfectly, right? We have like centimeter level accuracy of our space. So we had to have the hardware be able to accommodate that error. And so that took longer to get there. But once we got the hardware in place, we were using it's still using a lot of kind of, hard coding as it's called, right, to make the software work. But once the hardware was in place, then the software became the more challenging place. How do you make it easier to use, right? How do you make it so that you can map faster? Setup time is so big for construction, right? If it's changing so much, if you say, well, we'll map today and we'll start work tomorrow, the map will be different. So then it really kind of changed. So that's what I've seen a lot with robotics is sometimes you have to have one building block and then something, then that enables the next one. And then that gets to be challenging, right? And we also work a lot on our process side. So I didn't even mention that, but we have like teams just looking at materials and stuff. So sometimes when the process team figures out a new parameter, now the hardware team might have to make a change and then the software have to make a change. So the paint kind of keeps rotating around, but I would say to get started, it was getting a hardware that could go out there and be robust in a very different condition.
Got it. So, with your comment actually about process just now, there's, another question from the audience around, productivity and your workflows. So what kind of tools or apps do you use to, help prioritize, both personally, for your own workflows, but maybe also like, as a company, how do you guys sort of think about that?
Yeah, I'll start with as a company because it's sometimes a little easier than personally, but we use OKR planning, so objectives and key results, to help us kind of stay connected, especially as you grow. Like I said, it's so important for everybody to know kind of what's the North Star, right? We love exploring things, but at the same end of the day, this is the North Star. So we use that. Those get, we use Wrike, which is a project management tool so that those get split up. Like, how do we get that objective? Well, this is a project. And then we actually use Jira more for the task tracking, right? That, especially from the software side, that is very common. So it's kind of like you start from what's your objective, you build up the projects, and then, the managers themselves specifically say, well, these are the tasks that I need to achieve that project that achieves that objective. So we kind of go at it from like top down and bottoms up from a company side. And then staying connected and talking through those challenges, right? Like, even as you're progressing, like, is this still the right objective? Did something change? We focus a lot on getting data back from our field so that we can be data driven. I think it's too easy to fall into qualitative, like, it looked like he was struggling with this part, so let's focus on improving that part of the user interface, versus like, oh, here's, in a day, how much time they spent. And sometimes, you find might not be what you're most excited about. There's no machine learning to this. It's just making the machine easier to use. And so we use a lot of data to ensure that we don't get a little bit caught up in like the more exciting parts, but really focus on the big low-hanging fruit. And personally, for me, I do use some of those tools, right, to kind of keep a task list. But I'm trying to remember the name of it, but this was a new one through coaching, which was a little bit right down at the start of the day, like the 3 to 5 things that you have to get done. And that's been a helpful tool for me, because sometimes the task list can just be really long, but just being able to keep these, like, at the start of the day when everything's clear, before I've opened Slack, I can kind of write down these things and prioritize my time in that. And then I still keep writing down like the things that come up during the day, but it helps me to kind of not get caught up in like, little fires that might come up. I still have kind of this ability to say like, yeah, but at the end of the day, this presentation has to get done, or this decision has to be made.
Another question from the audience, really kind of, I think, around your, pricing and business model, and also I think maybe just sort of thinking about the full sort of product life cycle. There's creating the product, but then there's also kind of maintaining and updating and upgrading it over time. So how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a super interesting question, especially going into an industry that doesn't have robotics, right, as much. I think it creates a little bit where you're building this business model as you're building the technology. So that's been as much as a challenge as technology. One of the decisions we made early on with that push that I talked about, getting the crappiest, quickest machine out there to test it, was we decided to actually offer it as a service. So we became part of the union. We brought on people who do the work, journey people, and we did the work ourselves. What that allowed us to do is that it removed the friction for the customer to figure out, how do I buy a robot, when we're still figuring it out ourselves. We just said like, hey, you pay Johnny's drywall this much, pay us this much. We use robots, but at the end of the day, you get the same thing. You don't have to deal with the setup. So it was a great launching pad. It allowed us to learn like directly by doing it. And when we did have problems, we had the amazing people to help us do it manually, and the customer didn't have to take any of the risk. So I think that was a great starting point. But interestingly, as we kind of got better and better, the customer then pushed us and said, okay, well, we've seen that the machine now works. We want to use it. So we're right now actually right into getting into leasing of the machines, because they saw, like, once the machine was demonstrated, they saw that this win. And it works well for us because it allows us to get into what we want to do, which is be technology provider. So it allows us to scale quicker by having the people, their customers, use it themselves and provide feedback. So it's been a little bit, I think, looking at what creates the least friction, but that might change over time. For us, the services created least friction, and then that changed over time when they were like, wait, now you're good. Now we want to do it. So it's kind of this interesting part. So I think it's just especially for pricing, that you just need to understand the market a lot, understand what drives your customers. Like I said, what's that relationship? between who's paying, who's their customer, right? Because it is not always as direct, and you really got to think through where is the value sitting, who's earning, who's getting the value, and how do you make sure that your direct customer gets most of that value.
Got it. Switching tacks a little, what was your first robot?
Oh, I think that must have been, yeah, first robotics. I think the first year that I joined, I had like remote control cars, but I would consider that my first robot. We had to build this, it was like this wedge robot, and we got to like push people around by getting underneath them. It was pretty cool.
And what's the best advice you've ever received from a mentor or a coach, I guess, in your case?
Yeah, I think that it's just always been a little bit of this, like, go ask the questions, right? Like I said, with my advisor in undergrad and graduate school, was like, you can sit there and overthink it, which I often do, or you could just go ask questions. So try something out. That would be one. And the other one that I received actually through some coaching was also like being okay being a little bit more vulnerable with your team. I think that's helped me a lot, right? Like, I don't know it all. I'm figuring it out, some of it. So I think being more honest with the team of like, we're going to try this. I think this is the right way forward. But believe me, I'm very aware that this is new and this is changing. So that's made it, I think, easier for the team to be like, hey, that didn't work so well. Or just feel a little bit more like, oh, I can also try something, right? If I'm a little bit more open about that, I don't know everything. Like I said, bringing in people who knew that complementary, just being so like, yep, this is it. This is who I am. But I'm going to make myself stronger with other people, or I'm going to make myself stronger by trying something else out. And being okay with that, being out there and upfront. I think early on, I was just like, make sure you look like you've got everything together and you know everything. And that just made it a little bit harder for people to kind of help you, right? It just didn't seem like you needed help.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this idea of vulnerability in leadership is a really important one that I think more and more people are talking about. I mean, I guess like on that note, we often hear about, the highlights of people's journeys, especially, people are extremely successful, and, it can be really helpful sometimes, I think, especially for people earlier in their careers, to also hear about, the challenges, the obstacles, the things that maybe didn't go as well. Can you share anything that, happened in your experience?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I agree with you. I think we over talk about the things that are successful. It also bothers me that people often talk as like one person created a company. You're like, well, no, probably it was the 200 people that were on their team that created. But that's beside. I think for me, one of the hardest things was like letting go of your first employee, like having to let someone go. That was like such a low point, like something I just never thought about when you're building a company. But there is going to be these places where you don't match. And and there's been more since then. And in some cases, it's been just as much my fault, right? Like maybe I didn't know exactly the position that I needed, so hired somebody. So I think those have been just times of like reflection and being really hard, because you get so excited about building this team and then sometimes it just doesn't work. So I would say those are definitely the points that, like, I don't know, I don't think it ever came up in an entrepreneurship class that you might have to reduce your team or change things. And then fundraising, I think, can be like a gut punch, right? Like sometimes you hear some people, it goes really smoothly, but my experience is that it's more like talking to a lot of people until you find ones that like kind of meet, right? And I think that it can be frustrating because it's a lot of time, a lot of something that obviously you believe in, and it's just like people from the other side kind of pushing you or challenging you or not even saying anything and not just deciding not to move forward. So it can definitely be a confidence, killer, because you're just kind of feeling a little bit of that judgment without understanding all of the details, or just frustration. You hear somebody else did it so quickly and they got all this money, and you're just like, what am I doing wrong? So I think fundraising is one of those that, like, it's never the same for anybody, but at least from my experience, you hear of the ones who have an easy path, which is maybe 5%, and you don't hear much about the 95% who are like 6 months into it and like getting to the hard parts. I think that's something that would be more interesting to hear more about from people. Is like, look, there is a lot of talking. There's a lot of maybe even having to say like, okay, we're not going to fundraise, we're going to get to the next milestone. It's not as easy as people make it sound on Twitter.
I mean, that is definitely very, very, very true. And even for the ones that do sound easy on Twitter, I think sometimes if you actually dig a little bit deeper beneath the surface and you actually understand that all the details of how that fundraise came to be, it might actually be a lot more challenging. Well, with that, thank you so much for your time, Maria. This was wonderful. I think everyone really appreciated this. Also thank you again to my Women Robotics Committee members, audience. Thank you so much for attending this talk. And the previous ones in our series have also been recorded. So please keep an eye out and share the video with your friends later on. Thank you again,
Thank you so
everyone.
much, Cynthia. This was fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Take care. Bye.